much for those member statements today. We'll now get ready to move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The province is spending $22 million this year on tourism in Nova Scotia. There's another $15 million on the Nova Scotia to Maine ferry in the transportation budget. That's $37 million of tourism-related dollars. So nearly half of our tourism dollars go to the ferry. We have over 2.4 million visitors to Nova Scotia by all points of entry. We have 50,000 visitors from the ferry. So we're spending $15 million to bring in 50,000 people, $20 million to bring in $2.4 million. My question for the Premier, is it the Premier's vision for this province and the future of tourism that half of the visitors to this province will ultimately come via that ferry?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank all those in the tourism industry, Mr. Speaker, who have allowed us for the third consecutive year to have a record season in tourism. I also want to thank the people, Mr. Speaker, in Yarmouth and surrounding area in southwestern Nova Scotia who have been working very hard to build back the tourism industry and service down there that was devastated, quite frankly, in 2009. Mr. Speaker, we as a government believe that the international link is an important one. We're pleased the fact that we have a 5-year deal now in Bar Harbour. We believe that will provide the stability that's required to continue to reduce the subsidy associated with that ferry. But we are committed, Mr. Speaker, to that international link.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the question was about vision. The answer was not, because there's no vision in how this file is being managed. Think about how good things could be for that region if it had a vision to properly manage and bring people there with that amount of money. That's what's missing here, Mr. Speaker. And there's so little vision. There's so little vision on what could be. The members are so restricted in what they think is possible for that region. They need to think big. There's so little vision that under the terms of the contract that the operator can do pretty much whatever they want. I'd like to ask the Premier, if that boat doesn't sail, does Bay Ferries still get their management fee?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, the vision is, Mr. Speaker, this population is all-time high in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. The vision is, Mr. Speaker, more young people are staying in this province and leaving, Mr. Speaker, for the third consecutive year. Mr. Speaker, the vision is we've just had a third consecutive year in record tourism numbers, Mr. Speaker. The reality is the vision, Mr. Speaker, is that we have a pre-primary next year that every 4-year-old in this province will have access regardless of the socioeconomic circumstances they belong in, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, the vision is we have the largest single capital investment in healthcare in the capital region, Mr. Speaker, in the history of this province. The vision is, Mr. Speaker, in Cape Breton, we've just announced a large capital infrastructure in Cape Breton Island, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is, the division is, we look at this province holistically. The honourable member looks for a divisive way to divide communities, to try to get cheap political points on the backs of our citizens, Mr. Speaker. It is unacceptable. That's the lack of vision. That's the lack of courage to stand in his place and tell the honourable member from Argyle-Barrington he doesn't support the Yarmouth Ferry either.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, lack of vision on display. Simple question. Don't sail the vessel, still get paid. I want a successful ferry on this route. This is the difference. This is the difference. This Liberal government wants a ferry. I want a successful ferry. That's the difference. Everything I see from this government, everything I see, including the fact that the Premier won't answer questions about the contract, confirms that they only want a ferry. We want a successful ferry. We have a vision. They don't. And if the Premier has a vision, I'd like to ask him a simple question. When you pay $60 million for something over 4 years, did you at least give the operators some key metrics so you can judge their activity and hold them accountable? Any key metrics, Premier, or just get it done?
I'd like to remind the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition to direct his questions through the Chair, the Honourable Premier.
That's okay, Mr. Speaker. He can continue to yell, Mr. Speaker. I will hear him. It's okay. Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, southwestern Nova Scotia is continue to see growth, Mr. Speaker. We're continuing to see the investment in the private sector, Mr. Speaker. Those are all positive signs where we see economic growth and job creation in Nova Scotia. The honourable member, again, looks for a way to divide communities across this province. He's pitting one community against another, and his solution is, Mr. Speaker, let's take the private sector to court, Mr. Speaker. That is one sure way to continue to grow the economy, create jobs, and provide opportunities for our sons and daughters, Mr. Speaker. Talk about lack of vision, Mr. Speaker. It is over there, Mr. Speaker. He wouldn't even show up to work yesterday to ask his questions.
Order, please. Order, please. Just like to remind the Honourable Premier it's not proper to reference who is or is not in the House at any given time. The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
When this government took office in 2013, there were 2 years left in the continuing care strategy, which provided for 180 nursing home beds on the South Shore, 42 in the HRM, 12 in Cape Breton, 67 in the Valley, 202 in Pictou, 152 in southwestern Nova Scotia, 99 in Cumberland, and that's just the replacement beds. The plan also called for adding 350 new bids into the system. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals threw that plan aside and none of this took place. Will the Premier acknowledge that his plan, by contrast, 89 beds in Mahone Bay and Metagan and North Sydney and New Waterford, falls miles short of where we would have been if he followed through on the plan that was given him in the first place?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable for the question. As he knows, Mr. Speaker, we've committed to providing 60 beds in both New Waterford, Mr. Speaker, and Northside. Those are all positive signs. He also knows we're working with proponents now when they look at expanding existing ones in Mahone Bay. We're hoping to add beds there as well in the one in Metagan, Mr. Speaker, where we are looking at ensuring that we have a cultural component to provide long-term care citizens for the Acadian community in our province, continue to support the fine work that's happening by that community. As part of that also will be looking at, is there a way to provide a small option homes with a culturally sensitive component that will allow the sons and daughters of our Acadian communities to find and get services in the language of their choice.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, that decision to throw aside the nursing home plan has had such wide-ranging impacts. We can think about Shoreham Village in Chester that was slated for replacement until 2013, but which still has not received it. As a result, today the pipes are rotting, water's dripping out of the ceiling into buckets in the hall. The exterior of the building needs serious refurbishment in order to be kept intact. Let me table, Mr. Speaker, some pictures of the situation, just in case there's anybody that has any doubt about it. The situation is one of many that has persisted around the province since the continuing care plan was thrown out 6 years ago, with no commitments made to solve these issues. Let me ask the Premier, why has he put this wonderful facility and others like it at risk by starving them of maintenance and investment?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the honourable member will know we continue to invest in long-term care, Mr. Speaker. We know we want to thank the hardworking citizens across our province who continue to provide care for our loved ones and communities from one end of Nova Scotia to the other. We're continuing to work with operators to find ways that we continue to invest in their infrastructure at the same time, potentially providing more services in those particular communities, that we continue to add beds, but also have a way for the proponent to actually earn income based on other ways to rent. And for example, a family physician could be in one of these facilities, which would allow us to keep the per diem in a way that makes sense for all taxpayers, as well as providing those services in communities. And we're going to continue to find solutions as we continue to work, ensuring not only do we upgrade the current infrastructure around long-term care, but where appropriate, add beds.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, we should also not overlook the impact of that 2013 decision to throw aside the nursing home plan on alternate level of care patients themselves as they wait months and months for placement. These people pay nursing home rates, but they don't receive the care that a nursing home provides. They live in hospitals which lack the community programs, the recreational programs that every nursing home in Nova Scotia has. Having prepared themselves to move into long-term care, they find themselves living long times in long-term limbo. Does the Premier not recognize that people wouldn't today be having to go through all this if he had stuck with the nursing home plan that he'd been given?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member knows, Mr. Speaker, that prior to the New Democratic Party being defeated, Mr. Speaker, in 2013, there was a number of promises and commitments made with no financial ability to pay for that. He would also know, Mr. Speaker, there was a $600 million deficit left there on an annual basis, Mr. Speaker. The inability not only to invest in long-term care beds or anything else in this province, and we continued down the path that the economic growth they were going. So we continue to make those investments. We'll continue to work with our partners, Mr. Speaker, to provide the services that Nova Scotians deserve and want in their communities. And I'm looking forward to seeing the redevelopment that's going to take place in Northside, Mr. Speaker, as well as in New Waterford, and I hope the honourable member will support that.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Transportation. Last week, the government announced that they would be spending $8.5 million on renovations to the port terminal in Bar Harbour. I understand that Bay Ferries negotiated this deal with Bar Harbour on behalf of the province. So it was the private company that was negotiating on how to spend Nova Scotia taxpayer dollars and how they would be spent. I'd like to ask the Minister, was there a maximum amount that the department indicated to Bay Ferries that it would be willing to spend for the upgrades at Bar Harbour, or was it just a blank check?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to be on my feet to talk about the plateau that we have reached in permanently establishing the service between Nova Scotia and Maine. We have a 5-year agreement, and we are now in a position to stabilize this service, which has been in an unstable situation since it was unceremoniously dumped in 2010, to start with. My department was regularly informed of the negotiations, and the renovations and the cost estimates. We've been a partner to the process all along, and we're very confident that the amount of money that's been designated for this renovation in Bar Harbour reflects the true cost of that project. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the definition of sustainability obviously has different ways to be defined in this House. 2 ports in 3 years. And the thing that can make this service most sustainable is an actual vessel. There's 6 years left in the contract, 1 year of a vessel. They don't even know what boat will be in operation 1 year from now, Mr. Speaker. So as we know that the agreement for the current CAT vessel expires this year. And there's no vessel for the year after that. That may be sustainable, but we need an actual vessel. Because of the way the contract is written and the broad powers that Bay Ferries have to negotiate on behalf of the province, seemingly at any cost, I'd like to ask the Minister, what's to stop Bay Ferries from finding a boat that costs $10 million a year and lucking in for that deal, and the taxpayers will have to pay it?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. If anybody took the time to read the publicly available contract, you will find that there are all kinds of provisions in there that prevent the operator from doing anything that we do not approve of. The season The vessel is secured for the season before us. We're in absolutely great shape going in, and I would just like to point out that there is provision in the contract for no management fees to be paid if the contract is terminated.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. Last year, the department made changes to allow income assistance recipients to keep more of what they earn if they work. Those who are fortunate enough to have long-term employment are eligible for EI. However, if they are laid off and receive benefits they have paid into, then this money is clawed back at 100%. When I asked the minister about this in the fall, she indicated that she would look into it. However, in a response to a follow-up letter, the minister said an exemption of EI earnings was not being considered, and I can table that. Mr. Speaker, will the minister reconsider and agree to treat EI benefits the same as employment earnings?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for her question. We want all Nova Scotians to enjoy lives involved in their communities and things like that. We want them to have rich lives here in Nova Scotia. One of the things about income assistance, it is the program of last resort. So when people have other ways of getting support, we do ask them to do that. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, with respect, people living on income assistance, as the minister has referred to, are living in abject poverty. And to expect them to have all of their EI, which they have paid into, clawed back is simply unreasonable and unfair. Mr. Speaker, Halifax artist Josh Dunn received a grant from Arts Nova Scotia to make a film that had been years in development. When he told the department he would be paying himself a small fee out of that grant, the department told him they would be clawing back 100% of that money from his ESIA payment. Mr. Speaker, if the minister was actually committed to improving the lives of people living on low incomes, then her government would not be using every opportunity possible to take the money away from them. Mr. Speaker, will the minister apologize to Mr. Dunn and agree to treat self-employment income the same as other employment earnings?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, and of course we all should recognize that these particular rules have been in place for many, many years, including the 4.5 years that the NDP were in government. And, Mr. Speaker, I was kind enough to listen to the honourable member make her statement. I would ask that she would at least allow me to finish my answer without being interrupted, Mr. Speaker. What I would like to let the honourable member know is that, in fact, we are looking at that exact question right now, and I expect to have something to announce soon. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, I think one thing we can all agree on here is that people of Nova Scotia are heavily taxed. The highest in the country, actually. One tax that could be changed that people believe is an unnecessary tax grab is the deed transfer tax. This tax increases housing costs and the fee cannot be mortgaged. It cannot be included in financing costs. There's no cost to a municipality in the transfer of a deed other than a small administration expense. The deed transfer tax is a hidden tax that gets lost in a massive expense, yet it's real dollars taken from the pockets of Nova Scotians. My question for the Minister of Municipal Affairs is, has the minister and his government given any consideration to lowering the tax burden on Nova Scotians and specifically removing or lowering the deed transfer tax?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, honourable member, for the question. We have continued to support our municipal units who have actually the authority. They're their own level of government, Mr. Speaker. They make these decisions based on taxation for their revenue. It's the stream that they have to operate all of the great things that they do in each of their respective municipalities. With regards to the deed transfer tax, that is part of that collection. But we do support, through a variety of different grants, Mr. Speaker, our municipal units, and we'll continue to do that into the future.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, the municipalities throughout Nova Scotia have a deed transfer tax of about 1.5%. On the sale of a $200,000 property, it's an extra cost of $3,000 to transfer the deed, on top of real estate fees, banking fees, etc. On the sale of a $400,000 home, it's an extra $6,000. Let me remind the minister that this is a cost that cannot be financed, and most Nova Scotians do not have extra cash lying around of that amount. These are huge extra costs that are barriers to doing business. Many people believe home sales would actually increase if the deed transfer tax was lowered or removed. It's a tax grab, Mr. Speaker, plain and simple. And it's a tax grab during a time when people are making the most expensive and important purchase of their lives. Will the minister and his government consider removing or lowering the deed transfer tax?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much again, Mr. Speaker. We're always looking for ways to continue the great work that we're doing with our municipalities to offer them assistance as required. As I said, we're doing a variety of different grants. We're always looking at new opportunities, and if municipalities wish to discuss this issue, Mr. Speaker, this minister will be more than happy to have that conversation.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities passed a resolution in the fall of 2018 asking the province to provide equitable funding for J-class roads. Many here in the province know a moratorium was placed on paving gravel roads. Residents and subdivisions asked municipalities in the province how they could get their road paved, and J-class road program was adopted. But municipalities are finding it hard to cover their expenses in their municipal budgets for J-class roads, hence the resolution. My question to the Minister of Municipal Affairs, can he provide an update today on his department's response to the resolution from Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities for asking for equitable funding for J-class roads?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, municipalities are their own level of government. They make decisions on what their priorities are, Mr. Speaker. And again, we work with them regularly, both on their priorities, but again, by way of different grants that we support each of our municipal units with, and we'll continue to do so.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, they do decide where they spend their money, but they have specifically asked the province to help them with this issue, with J-class road funding. Taxpayers are paying enough in this province. Property taxes are high. Yet when a municipality decides to pave a J-class road, they often will impose an area rate to the property owner, increasing property taxes even higher. Other times, municipalities place a lien on a property for a fee based on the per linear foot road frontage of that property. In some cases, decisions of some homeowners impose the cost onto another homeowner who may not actually want their road paved or cannot afford their share of the cost. Higher costs to our citizens and increased taxation pose potential hardship, Mr. Speaker, on our citizens. My question to the Minister of Municipal Affairs is the Minister aware that municipalities are creating bylaws to this effect, and does he believe that this is a fair way to fund these roads?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have a current program whereby we put $2 million. We cost share. The municipalities also put $2 million into J-class roads. That's a program that's been in place, will continue to be in place, Mr. Speaker. And again, if there's further conversations that we are looking to have around that, government is always open to have those kinds of conversations, and we'll continue to work closely with our municipal units.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Solid waste management has become one of the most expensive line items for Nova Scotia municipal governments. Total costs in 2017 exceeded $91 million. Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities passed a resolution requesting the province to develop legislation and regulations in full support of extended producer responsibility for printed paper and packaging. This will be an added expense to businesses trying to make a profit here in this province, an expense that their competitors outside of Canada may not have. My question to the Minister of Municipal Affairs is, can he provide an update today on his plans to respond to this request from the Federation of Municipalities?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. We've had some discussion with the NSFM at the round table last fall. We'll be looking to more of that discussion as we come in to the spring. I've met with the current president of the NSFM as well as the past. The ERP, I guess as it's referred to, has been discussed a couple of times on this. And I will tell you right up, Mr. Speaker, we are a ways away from a decision on this. There's a lot of work to go into this. It's more complicated than some might think, but we are indeed looking at this issue.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, I believe, and we believe here in the PC caucus, that all levels of government should be looking at ways to save the taxpayer money. Kind of like the taxpayers are our shareholders, and we are the board of directors to running an effective government. We need to ensure that we're running an efficient, effective government. So on that topic of solid waste management, I want to ask the Minister of Municipal Affairs if he's aware of a private company in Chester that sealed a deal to revolutionize waste management. Sustain Technologies has plans to convert 90% of Chester's trash into clean energy. This company will remove the future need for landfills. This company will turn waste into a resource, and this company will lower the costs of solid waste management for municipalities. My question to the Minister of Municipal Affairs is, will he encourage other municipalities to follow Chester's leads and look for innovative ways to lowering the cost for municipal governments?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the honourable member. And absolutely, we're always looking for ways to do business efficiently and effectively in this province. We have been leaders for years in effectively diverting from landfills, Mr. Speaker, and we'll continue to do so. We'll continue to work with all of our municipal units, and if they have got creative ideas like this, we're willing to listen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Environment. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report says we need to have ambitious action from every level of government to address the very real crisis of climate change. We need to be making unprecedented investments now. And, Mr. Speaker, it was very disappointing for Nova Scotians to note that in the budget, even the words climate change were glaringly absent, let alone any kind of money. There was not even the mention, there was anything that would create the rapid and exciting transition to a clean, green economy. And a few weeks ago, high school students even walked out of class to protest this lack of government action. So, Mr. Speaker, can the minister please explain why her government is choosing to burden our children and our grandchildren with the costs, chaos, and catastrophic reactions that will be the outcome of climate change by not investing in a clean future now?
Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I really want to thank the minister opposite, or the member opposite, for bringing up this very important subject. It gives me the opportunity to really talk about what is happening in our green economy. We are the federal leaders in reducing greenhouse gases. We will have 30% below the 2005 levels, and we have a very ambitious goal of 45 to 50% below by the year 2030. We are also the leaders in solid waste diversion. We have almost half of the solid waste diversion of other areas. So I think it's believed 404 kilograms per person, where most areas are above 700, Mr. Speaker. This government has done so much. We just introduced the first Coastal Protection Act, Mr. Speaker. That really speaks towards what's happening with climate change. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, in that list, most of the things she mentioned were done by the NDP government, by the Conservatives before that, and also by municipalities. Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, but it needs to be said, it is our duty as citizens of this world to make real investments to prevent climate change. We need to make investments on the scale of the ones our grandparents' generation made during the war effort. The Minister and the Premier talk as if addressing climate change is about individual sacrifices from regular people who are already struggling, but it's not. The IPCC report calls for government action, Mr. Speaker, not individual sacrifice. So I'd like to know, why is this government keeping us in a weak and polluting economy when a clean and prosperous green economy is not only possible but vital for our survival?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I have to agree with the member opposite. That doesn't happen very often. But anyway, I will also acknowledge former governments that have played their part in this, and we're working forward. We're looking forward to continuing that. We have been continuing that. I mean, we've seen Nova Scotia bring in the first cap-and-trade legislation on our terms, Mr. Speaker. You know, we're seeing our neighbours that are going to have a large increase in the price of their fuels come April 1st, and Nova Scotia doesn't have that. We have a very moderate increase. You know, we're talking still about our protected areas in our wetlands areas that are carbon sinks. We're protecting those areas. We have almost 12.5% of our province now is protected. When you start looking at 35% of our property is actually Crown land, we're protecting up to 13% in the near future. That's a big goal, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue the battle. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Mr. Speaker, there is a group at home which is known as the NSEF, and they are a group that believes that the municipality of CBRM is not getting its fair share of the equalization payments that the province receives from the government in Ottawa. My question to the minister is quite simple. Could he explain to us why he believes that this formula is fair?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that we put, of the municipal operating grants that go out across this province, we put 50%. That's somewhere in the vicinity of $15 million, Mr. Speaker, into industrial Cape Breton alone. There's been a lot of that. We recognize there's always pressures. There's probably never enough money, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, and every municipal unit across this province would have an ask of some kind for this project or that project, Mr. Speaker. We've done an awful lot in the CBRM, Mr. Speaker. We moving NSCC downtown Sydney. Spoke yesterday about other projects. Millions of dollars going into the second berth. Millions of dollars going into New Dawn, Mr. Speaker. New schools, new teachers, more teachers. Big announcement this week in the budget, Mr. Speaker. Healthcare announcement. Millions of dollars going into industrial Cape Breton on hospital expansions, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the minister for his answer, but I believe an intention to move a school downtown is much different than actually moving it downtown, unless somebody got a U-Haul since I came up here on Tuesday. Mr. Speaker, on May the 18th of last year, a letter was written by myself and my colleagues from Victoria the Lakes and Northside Westmount asking the Premier and the Minister of the day to have an audit done by the Auditor General on the way the funds flow to the CBRM and other municipal units. If you are so convinced, Mr. Minister, that this indeed is a fair and equitable way, would you please ask the Auditor General to do an audit on these transfer payments?
I'd like to remind the honourable member to keep his comments and questions directed through the chair. The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the honourable member's question. As for an audit goes, the department and myself are doing an extensive audit on exactly how this program has been operating and what the view for the future might be, Mr. Speaker. And as soon as that is actually done, we will be reporting that back to the members of this House and all Nova Scotians, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, in 2009, the province accepted the National Strategy for Critical Infrastructure. Critical infrastructure refers to processes, systems, facilities, technologies, networks, assets, and services that are essential to the health, safety, and security and economic well-being of Canadians and the effective functioning of our government. It's pretty important stuff. Yet in 2016, the Auditor General completed an audit and found that our province did not have an implementation plan to meet our commitment for this national strategy for critical infrastructure. This week, the Auditor General released another update that confirms this recommendation remains incomplete. My question to the Minister responsible for Emergency Management Office is why has his office failed to come up with a plan to safeguard Nova Scotia's critical infrastructure?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And there were 4 items that the Auditor General, I believe, reviewed and that made recommendations on from that report. And we certainly welcome those recommendations, Mr. Speaker. We see them as a priority. We are 3/4 of the way through those. The 4th one should be complete a little bit later this year, but this should be done very soon.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General identified that Transportation Infrastructure Renewal and the Emergency Management Office did not have a risk management plan for the Canso Causeway connecting the mainland to Cape Breton or the Chignecto Isthmus connecting Nova Scotia to New Brunswick. If either of these critical pieces of infrastructure were compromised, it would cause significant economic disruption, potential environmental damage, and an interruption to emergency services leading to possible loss of life. My question to the Minister of Municipal Affairs is, can this minister explain why his department has failed to document risk assessments for critical infrastructure as highlighted by the Auditor General?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I said, 3 of the 4 of these actual very important recommendations have been completed, and we'll continue to work on completing number 4. And as I said, it is being worked on. It is in progress. We have had regular communication and updating the AG's office, and we'll continue to do that as we move forward. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Well, 3 out of 4 might sound good here, but it's critical infrastructure, and we made a commitment 10 years ago to implement this strategy, 10 years. Mr. Speaker, on another topic, 2016-2017, Pomax Consulting was engaged to undertake a review of the Nova Scotia Fire Service. Following the completion of the report, a stakeholders committee was assembled, and they have been developing an action plan to explore identified issues such as fire service standards, organizational structure, short and long-term goals, as well as other areas for collaboration. My question for the Minister of Municipal Affairs, can he provide an update today to the House on the work of this committee?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And this is an important piece of work being done by this committee. What I do know from a recent update myself is that this is in progress. There is a lot of work to be done and has been done from what I understand so far, with quite a bit of work still to be done, but progress is being made, and we hope to have, I've been anxious to see the final on this as well. We look forward to that and see what those standards look like, and we'll make preparations for implementation when we're ready to do so.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It would be nice if the minister was to be able to provide some details, just rather than saying some of the work has been done. So on that topic, there has been some discussion on centralization of fire dispatch services, and some municipalities support this move while others are against it. As I understand it, fire dispatch services was part of what the Stakeholders Committee was studying. Can the Minister of Municipal Affairs provide us an update today on the plan for fire dispatch services for the province?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and this is something that is near and dear to my heart. I come from a world of the dispatch world of communications around EHS as a former paramedic and a long time there. I certainly understand the fire service, the dispatch, the importance of that, and the timely and the essence is important of getting out the door. We are working on this. There's been a number of municipalities and different organizations that have reached out to me by way of correspondence that has been sent to me asking for a review of this. We are reviewing it. Again, it's a very detailed process. It's being done differently around the province. We're not sure what the end result looks like, but I can assure the Honourable Member and all members of this House, this is something that I am working on and will continue to work on, and we need to have something in place sooner rather than later as far as I'm concerned, Mr. Speaker. And again, we'll do this with the assistance of our municipalities, our fire service. Again, this is complicated. There's a lot to it, and we know that some are very much in favour of it, Mr. Speaker, and there may be some who are not. But we need to put in place a secure and safe dispatch system for the province right across Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
What?
My question again is for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. In 2011, the Auditor General completed an audit which cited the Fire Marshal's Office was not doing an adequate job of protecting the public from a fire safety risk in buildings. The report also found that the Fire Marshal's Office lacked fundamental information to effectively manage its operations. I realize this was 8 years ago, but in 2015 a review was done and 14 out of the 25 recommendations had not been completed. My question to the Minister is, can he provide this House with a report and an update on how many recommendations have been done to date?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Honourable Member for the question. Of those 25 recommendations from that report, 18 have actually been completed to date. There are 7 left. 3 of those are due to be completed in the next 2 months, I'm told. The other 4 is working in conjunction with municipalities on the oversight. We'll continue to work with them and also look to, they're in progress, and we're looking to see how we can complete those in a timely fashion as well.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for the answer. One of the recommendations that was not completed as of 2015 was recommendation 6.5, stated the Office of the Fire Marshal should implement performance standards for the Deputy Fire Marshal's activities. To quote the 2011 report, performance evaluations are necessary to ensure the staff are meeting desired performance expectations, including recognizing of good performance, as well as identifying and addressing areas in which staff require development. And I'll table that. The Office of Fire Marshal needs to develop a process, the ongoing monitoring of the evaluation for the staff. My question is, does he know if this evaluation is going on now for the Deputy Fire Marshals?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs. Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. What I can tell you is the Fire Marshal's team are continuously providing performance feedback throughout the course of the year on a regular basis. Mr. Speaker, daily communications, meetings, verbal discussions and feedback. These performance evaluations are all part of what we do on a regular basis and will continue to do so. And Mr. Speaker, as Minister, I would expect that all of these staff would have a regular performance evaluation just like every other public servant does across this province.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. Yesterday, when I asked the Minister to take action on the street check report, rather than answer my question, the Minister chose to argue about a technicality. He said, quote, Dr. Wortley did not phrase the findings of his report in the form of a recommendation. He presented two options. Mr. Speaker, the recommendations from that report are clear. The status quo is not an option, and Dr. Wortley has called on the government to either ban or regulate street checks and to impose an immediate moratorium while action is considered, and I will table that. Mr. Speaker, why is the minister allowing police street checks, a practice rooted in systemic racism, to continue while community members, academics, senators have been clear that this practice must end now?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for the question. I want to reiterate, Mr. Speaker, that I have said publicly that the findings of the Wortley report, quite frankly, are alarming and they are unacceptable. And we are taking steps. We're taking steps, Mr. Speaker, to address that. Just today, I gave directives to our law enforcement community. They are to cease using street checks as part of a quota system. They are ceased. The direction has been given to cease using street checks as part of a performance measurement tool. There's a need, Mr. Speaker, quite frankly, for training around the law enforcement community specific to the Charter of Rights, their authorities, the missions, visions and values and code of ethics of law enforcement agencies, Mr. Speaker. We have to address this problem. We will address this problem, Mr. Speaker. It will be inclusive not only of the law enforcement community, but the communities who are most impacted.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. However, street checks should never have been part of a quota or performance management tool, ever. So ceasing those is the very tip of the iceberg. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, after the powerful report that we heard and the community voices, the Minister addressed the media and called street checks a valuable policing tool when used correctly. However, Dr. Wortley was clear that there is very little evidence at all that street checks impact local crime rates in any way. Street checks are not an effective policing practice and have done and continue to do significant harm to the Black community. This practice must be suspended while a permanent solution is determined. Mr. Speaker, will the minister acknowledge that in spite of having clear evidence laid out for him, he is permitting a racist and discriminatory practice to continue in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I appreciate my colleague's question. This is a very serious matter that we are giving immediate attention to. But I want to remind my colleague, I'm acknowledging everything that Dr. Wortley has identified in the content of the report. And it is alarming, Mr. Speaker, and it is simply unacceptable, and we will take steps to address that. But what my colleague has not shared with this legislature and all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, is Dr. Wortley himself said that a ban in itself may simply be symbolic and not change the experience on the street. That's not lost on me, Mr. Speaker. It's important, Mr. Speaker, that I put a common sense, sound judgment lens to the work and redress that we will take to ensure that this practice stops into the future.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Environment. As we all know, in this chamber, Northern Pulp submitted their application in January 2019 to build a new effluent treatment facility, which would include a pipe carrying the effluent through Pictou's watershed and then into our beautiful Northumberland Strait. March 9th, 2019 was the deadline for concerned citizens and stakeholders to deliver their submissions. So I would like the Minister to confirm, please, how many submissions did the Department of Environment actually receive?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for that question. In all, there were we had 1,700 pages that came from Northern Pulp, their submission themselves. On top of that, we had the public post all their comments online. We had, I believe, 918, although there are a couple of variations of those. I was able to read all of them as well as all of the material, and I'm pleased to announce that there will be a decision made tomorrow, and I invite any members of the House to come join me at noon tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the Minister for her answer. I received some of those submissions as well, and I had the opportunity to read them carefully in all of them, and there was a lot of detail in all of them. A lot of blood, sweat, and tears went into these submissions, and it is my hope that every single one was read in depth, whether it was hundreds of pages or a few statements on a single piece of paper. And yes, it is public knowledge, and it has been confirmed today that the Minister plans to release her findings on the application tomorrow. The Minister has stated that she was able to read all submissions, although they only came in March 9th, and I know that I received hundreds. So I would like to ask the Minister if she can confirm that was she the only one that read all these submissions that came into her department so that a thorough decision can be made.
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for that question. Certainly, I took a lot of it was emotional reading all those statements, 918 plus statements, more or less, 4,500 pages. And certainly our March break, our spring break, and I know a lot of us are working through that break, was my reading week, and certainly was a time to be able to engage that. You know, I heard from businesses, from homeowners, business owners, and 9-year-old little girls, and they were all expressing what their thoughts were and what they thought about Northern Pulp and the impact that it would have. Certainly, I took that very seriously, and I can share that my staff also read all those, as well as all the material, and made recommendations based on all that material. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me first of all begin by thanking the government and the Health Authority for once again recruiting a medical laboratory technologist for Buchanan Memorial Hospital in Neil Service. Mr. Speaker, this will go a long way in providing service continuation to the people in the North Smoky area. However, Mr. Speaker, it's not been confirmed as to whether or not the position is permanent or temporary. So my question to the Minister of Health is this: can the Minister inform this House whether this is a full-time position or a temporary part-time position?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I believe the Health Authority reported on the weekend, that they are continuing the services, the lab services at Buchanan Memorial, and part of that process is recruiting the replacement MLT to fill that position on a permanent basis to provide those services.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Minister for that response. Over the past number of weeks, discussion has been taking place in this House on point-of-care testing as the best thing to happen to Buchanan. And everyone is glad to see this will not be the case. But point-of-care testing can be done after hours in emergencies. But, Mr. Speaker, one of the fears in the community is this might only be done between now and when point-of-care testing actually takes place. So my question to the Minister is this: will he commit to the residents of the North of Smoky area that the technologist position that is being reinstated is indeed permanent and will not be replaced by point-of-care testing?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can confirm that the efforts to recruit and maintain those lab services, Mr. Speaker, is to be ongoing. As far as point-of-care testing, as I've previously spoken in the legislature about the evolution of the technology and that it can still provide important service, may still be a service and a technology deployed at that site and other communities, but that's to work in conjunction with and alongside the lab services at that hospital and not a replacement one for the other.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Premier. Mr. Premier, first I want to start off by saying Nova Scotia is very fortunate. We have a lot of great healthcare workers in all different aspects. The announcement that was made in Sydney on Monday was an excellent announcement. The problem, Mr. Premier, is there was no human resources plan. The problem, Mr. Speaker, was there's no human resources plan. We still do not know how the people that are going to be served by this building are going to actually have doctors. Mr. Speaker, the Premier and the Minister of Finance have taken great pride in the fact that there's new doctors coming. But
order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired.